I'm just going to go ahead and throw this to Andy. So feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Vicki. So as she mentioned, my name is Andy Seagorn. I am a borough planner in the Department of City Planning Queens office. I'm a liaison for Board 12, which includes a pretty large part of Southeast Queens. And full disclosure, you may hear a screaming 7-week-old baby in the background, so apologies in advance for that. This is his fussy time. But just really quickly before we start, I'll just quickly hand it over to Haekyung to introduce herself, and then we'll get into the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andy. My name is Haekyung Ye. I am a senior borough planner at the Queens office. I cover districts 6 and 7, and hello, Phil. I'm excited to be part of this, and I will be participating in the Q&A, and looking forward to a full, robust discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Haekyung. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm also going to turn off my video because sometimes my computer crashes. It should be coming up just a second. There it goes. Okay. Can everybody see at least full screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Okay, so just to kind of go over what we're going to go over tonight, or even before that, let me just preface and kind of detail a little bit what Vicki was saying about zoning. So just in general, zoning is a regulatory tool that at its most basic level controls essentially what you can build, how much bulk or density is allowed, and essentially where it can be built within your community. The Uniform Land Use Review process is sort of the official process citywide that controls how the zoning is changed, and you as community board members have a really essential part of that. But as part of this module, we're going to kind of go over what zoning does and doesn't do, who enforces and administers different zoning regulations and how it's changed, where zoning applies, and sort of a basic introduction to navigating the zoning resolution itself. We'll also provide a really brief overview of zoning's historical context in New York City and some of the ways that the zoning resolution has evolved to respond to certain planning challenges. So the city charter gives the authority to the City Planning Commission, also known as the CPC, to enact zoning map amendments or zoning text changes. These are some of the things that often come through your houses as community board members. The zoning resolution is essentially broken down into the text itself, which has quite a few different regulations on use and bulk regulations citywide. And then it has a series of index maps that essentially serve as the authoritative source for identifying zoning designations for properties subject to zoning. While the Department of City Planning provides technical assistance to the City Planning Commission, as well as members of the public and community boards, it also develops amendments to zoning some of the time. The City Planning Commission itself is the body that's officially mandated to enact those changes. So you'll learn essentially, while we write the rules or help the City Planning Commission enact the rules, the Department of Buildings is the authority that has the ultimate authority to interpret and enforce zoning regulations, not us at City Planning. They often consult with us regarding interpretation, or sometimes we'll initiate that conversation to them if we believe that enforcement is not reflective of the zoning resolution. But the way it works is we help write the rules, we help facilitate changes to the rules by people who are not us, but the Department of Buildings is essentially in charge of enforcing those rules. The city charter also empowers a separate board of standards and appeals. This is also kind of known as the BSA, and you'll see some of those applications through the community board as well. And those provide kind of relief for any kind of hardship that the zoning resolution may unduly place on property owners. The BSA is empowered to provide variances in certain special permits, but not all, as authorized by the zoning resolution. And they're also kind of independent from us at City Planning and the City Planning Commission. So as you may already know, most of what gets built in New York City is, it doesn't follow review by the City Planning Commission or the City Council or you at community boards. Over 90% of it is done, quote unquote, as of right, which means that development can kind of proceed as long as in accordance with the rules of the zoning resolution as well as the building code. And it doesn't require additional review or approval by the City Planning Commission. So typically what happens if an owner wants to build something, they'll request a permit at DOB. And as long as it compiles with the zoning resolution and, for example, the other building codes, it can move forward. But one of the primary objectives of the city's zoning resolution is to provide a predictable land use framework. So an appropriate, well-considered land use pattern can kind of be supported without any adding arbitrary delays, someone hoping to build something in the city. So zoning is not planning itself, but it's one of the results or sort of tools used to enforce the planning process. It's a sort of a broad range strategic tool. But there's, often other types of tools that happen both at DCP as well as other city agencies that kind of contribute to the strategic planning of the city. So just generally speaking, what is zoning? Essentially, it reflects or affects the size and shape of buildings through regulating things like heights, yards, either in the side of the yard or in the rear of the building, setbacks, parking, how much unit size you're allowed, things like that. It also influences the series of permitted uses that are allowed on any given lot in the city and where they can be located within a building. So for example, if something can only be in the ground floor, or something can only be located above the ground floor, the zoning will often specify that. And through setting specific rules, zoning establishes a long-term patterns of development and provides a predictable framework for appropriate growth. So there's essentially a certain logic, strategically speaking, to planning, and any land use changes that you may see have to have a well thought out rationale. Zoning rules, they essentially apply to zoning lots, which are coterminous with tax lots almost all the time. And those are kind of drawn up through the Department of Finance. But they don't apply to the way that city streets are used. That's done either by DOT, and they don't necessarily apply to how parkland is used, which is administered by the Department of Parks and Recreation. So for example, sometimes I'll get a call that a commercial vehicle is parked on a street within a residential zoning district. But that's not necessarily in our house, that's enforced by DOT. Something also important to note, and this is kind of as a result of the US Constitution, that the state of New York can override local zoning rules, usually for development on state-owned land. But then there's also kind of wonky rules. For example, you'll hear it in the news right now that floor area ratios are actually capped by state law. So you can't go higher than 12 FAR, and that's a state regulation, that's not a city regulation. And then finally, private property may have private restrictions that apply to their land. So there might be, for example, some kind of restrictive covenant that prohibits a particular use that's maybe tied to that specific lot, but it's not applied generally in a neighborhood or throughout the city. These are usually civil arrangements and they're not enforced by DOB. So there's sometimes misconceptions about what zoning does and doesn't do, and we'll try to kind of flesh out what exactly zoning does do. So essentially, it's intended to provide a balanced or harmonious relationship between the different users of the city, and it also hopes to plan for a predictable framework for long-term development patterns, including the size and the shapes of buildings that are located within a particular community. While zoning does determine what uses are permitted, and it does determine the size and density of the building, it does not propose, although sometimes it can incentivize specific development projects. And it does not require demolition or change to an existing building. So if a new zoning district is applied on an existing building, that building can essentially stay the way it is. If today, a house is allowed and tomorrow the zoning changes to something like a non-residential use, the zoning doesn't require that building to immediately conform, essentially. So there's two words you'll often hear, and this is kind of a good sidebar for that. You'll hear the term conform, and that often relates to a building's use, whereas compliance relates to a building's bulk or size regulation. So if a building is a house and it's in a residential district, it's conforming. If the building's height or yard regulations are within the regulatory parameters of the underlying zoning district, that means it's compliant. And then finally, zoning does not dictate construction techniques or aesthetics. So you hear words like McMansion or cookie cutter design used in an often derogatory way, but the zoning does not decide what a good looking building is, at least in New York City. So there's kind of a lot of components from the 1961 zoning resolution that still apply today. So for example, the floor area ratio, or FAR, is essentially the principal bulk regulation that controls the size of a building. It tells us essentially how much floor area can go on a given zoning lot, but designating a specific use by the zoning district. So it's the ratio of the total building's floor area to the area of the zoning lot. And when you multiply the FAR to the lot area of the zoning lot, that's the maximum floor area that's provided. So as an example, if the FAR is 1.0 on a 10,000 square foot lot, you would multiply the FAR by the lot size. So 1 times 10,000, meaning that the lot could not exceed 10,000 feet of developable floor area, no matter how the building is arranged. These are kind of what you think of, generally speaking, when we hear the term bulk regulation. So just even beyond that as well, zoning provides regulations for other things. So this might be including off-street parking, affordable housing, walkability, public space requirements, sustainability, and resiliency. This is something that has been introduced more frequently in the last couple decades. And the zoning resolution establishes specific uses allowed in certain districts, as well as other things like loading or commercial parking that you'll see in things like manufacturing and commercial districts. So in zoning, we have something referred to as a building envelope, which is essentially a 3-dimensional space on a zoning lot within a structure that can be built after you apply all the zoning rules. So as we discussed, the floor area ratio, or FAR, is a big part of this, but there's a lot of other parameters you should consider. There are, lot width, lot setback requirements. There might be minimum lot size requirements. There's yard requirements that could restrict where a building could be located on a zoning lot. We also have height requirements that might further regulate depending on if the building's on a narrow street or a wide street. And then finally, there might be streetscape requirements that help to, at least in theory, enhance the quality of the public realm, such as tree planting requirements. You might also hear the term sky exposure plane. This may help regulate height in certain zoning districts. The sky exposure plane is essentially an imaginary sloping plane that begins at a certain height above the street line, behind which a building could be located. For other districts, especially in lower density districts, there might be a specific maximum building height, 35 feet, 45 feet, something like that. These and other regulations, there's quite a bit of details, but this is sort of the essential basics of what construct a essentially zoning on a specific lot. So just in terms of use, the city is essentially divided into 3 zoning categories. You have residential, or R, you have commercial, or C, or manufacturing, or M. And those are further divided into a range of lower, medium, and high density districts to accommodate sort of the wide range of uses and building form that we see citywide. So for example, you might have an R4 residential district, and that's going to permit a higher density than R1 or R2 or R3, but it's going to permit less density than an R5. So the number is usually a general guidance as to how much density is provided. And sometimes different uses are allowed to exist in the same mixed use district. The most common occurrence, or commercial overlays that support local commercial uses, are mapped often onto residential districts. So the existing land use may reflect existing zoning districts in some places. Zoning doesn't necessarily exist existing uses, right? So I spoke earlier that once a zoning district is established, the city can't compel a building to immediately conform. And then there's often different relief valves for non-conforming uses. So you might go to the BSA for a special permit or some other kind of relief in that case. So you'll see 2 maps on the screen. The one on the left is a thematic zoning map. The sort of lighter yellow, those are yellow or lower density residential districts. The darker yellow are higher density residential districts. The red are commercial districts. There's not too many, but you'll see them kind of in West Queens. The blue ones are mixed use districts. The purple are manufacturing districts. And then of course, parks are green. On the right, on the other hand, you'll see a land use map, and that shows kind of what's actually built in reality in these parts of the borough. So yellow is obviously residential. The more tan ones, and you'll see those kind of on some of the corridors, are showing mixed residential commercial. So you might have a retail space or an office on the lower floors, and then above that is residential. Red are the purely commercial ones. Dark purple is kind of industrial. Light purple is transportation or utilities. Blue is our public facilities or institutions. And then of course, open space is green. So different uses in the city are constructed through 18 different use groups. And these kind of range in intensity as the numbers go from high to or low to high. And they're sorted based on sort of similarity and compatibility of their functions. So low density or single or two family residential is going to be use group 1, but anything multifamily residential is going to be use group 2 as an example. And then obviously you wouldn't want a school or which would be use group 3, or a residential building, which would be use group 1 or 2, right next to something that would fall into something really intense, such as a garbage incinerator, which would be something like use group 18. So the point is essentially we're keeping certain zoning districts with compatible uses on the same house in order to prevent these sort of adjacencies which have certain environmental risks, certain health risks, things like that. So what you'll see here is essentially a chart on the left, and that shows which use groups are permitted in which zoning districts. So you'll see, for example, at the very top in R1 and R2 districts, that admits, lower density single family housing, as well as certain community facilities. And the zoning resolution kind of has a lot of footnotes about this, where additional regulations may apply, but this kind of gives you a general overview. And on the right is a snapshot from Appendix A of the zoning resolution, which shows a really long index of uses. It's alphabetical in its organization, and it shows you which zoning districts it's permitted in and which use groups it's located in. So you'll see here, schools, for example, are use group 3, and then you can see different kinds of schools, and then you can see which zoning districts they be permitted in. Some uses obviously have more flexibility than others, or some uses are allowed in more zoning districts than others. So for example, schools and houses of worship, both community facilities, are essentially allowed in all residential districts and most commercial districts. So after kind of going through some of the basics of how zoning is working functionally, I just wanted to cover some of the historical context, because it is helpful to understand what these forces are that created the need for zoning in New York City, and how it's been updated over time to reflect how the city has evolved. So zoning was essentially enacted to provide or to actually respond to buildings with inadequate light, air, and open space, and no separation of uses. So kind of as a result of this, in the 1800s and the early 20th century, there was a pretty big public health crisis citywide, and a lot of pressure from the public and certain advocacy groups to establish minimum requirements to regulate these sorts of things relating to the built environment. So if you've heard of tenement laws, this is kind of what we're talking about here. You'll see a progression of the light and air requirements over time. It wasn't regulated by zoning per se, but it was a series of regulations that essentially permitted increased regulation of light and air. So the first zoning resolution comprehensively nationwide was in Euclid, Ohio. And this was enacted as a result of the Euclid versus Ambler decision made by the Supreme Court. And then following World War II, we see a shift towards suburbanization, both inside the city as well as outside the city, as well as kind of an increasing understanding of the importance of open space. So the 1916 zoning resolution, which was enacted kind of right around the time of Euclid and Amber, it was kind of increasingly obsolete after World War II, and it was rewritten in 1961, which is sort of the basis of what we see today with the modern zoning resolution. So the basic framework of the zoning resolution is still in place, but there's been over time a series of updates to respond to new development and specific planning challenges, and it's enacted various changes throughout the zoning resolution as a result. You'll see a few of these on screen that have kind of come up as a result of this, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in the pursuing slides. So one of the big ones, and it affects probably a lot of the districts that you live in, and it's almost guaranteed that we have some of these in the community boards that you are participating in, is what you see as contextual zoning. This was introduced in the late 1980s, and it was essentially enacted in order to produce buildings that were consistent with the existing neighborhood character. You'll see, for example, on the left, Astoria is an example of having a lot of this R6B district. And that's kind of more reflective of these medium scale multifamily residences ranging from essentially 4 to 6 floors. And it's in an R6B, and the intention of this was to essentially preserve the scale and the harmonious streetscape of these medium density neighborhoods, as well as, you know, the 4-story attached buildings that you kind of see on, such as the ones in the image. And then what you see on the right here in Cambria Heights are contextual districts that only permit 1 and 2 family detached residences. And these are often characterized by, you know, 1 or 2 story houses, and then you might have an attic on top, as well as some parking on the side and a yard in often cases. After the enactment of contextual districts, we had mixed use districts, which were introduced in 1997, I believe in the Bronx first. And these allowed a mix of uses concurrently, particularly in areas where new residential development could coexist with existing manufacturing districts or existing manufacturing uses. Obviously, a lot of times these are kind of lighter end manufacturing uses. So you'll see this a lot in West Queens, in Hunters Point and Dutch Kills, where you'll see a building with a residential use right next to something that's either an office or some kind of retail or even a light industrial use. And oftentimes in these mixed use districts, you'll have both residential and non-residential within the same building. There's been a lot of other zoning changes throughout the years in the interest of kind of improving pedestrian experience and public realm, as well as waterfront. A lot of these have helped shape the waterfront that we see throughout the borough, especially in West Queens. There's often mandates for open space for lots next to the waterfront, or it may require access, public access to the waterfront. And then there's finally affordable housing. So this has kind of evolved over time, but what's happened essentially citywide is certain areas as a part of either neighborhood rezonings have been mapped with what's called voluntary inclusionary housing. And essentially you get a density bonus if you provide a certain number of units that are permanently affordable. There's also been something that's called mandatory inclusionary housing. And you'll see this often accompanying a lot of the zoning map changes that will come through the community board. And while voluntary is essentially voluntary, anyone who wants to build in a mandatory district must provide affordable housing pursuant to the requirements of that. And they, of course, get a density bonus for that as well. And then finally, following Hurricane Sandy, there was a series of text amendments and studies implemented to remedy the impacts of coastal flooding and sea level rise. So obviously Broad Channel was significantly impacted by Sandy about a decade ago. And these regulations were meant to essentially make sure that rebuilding was done in a way that was more resilient to both current impacts and especially these future impacts of climate change. So that was a lot. I'm aware of that, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, we're all ears. We can also provide further information on anything that we went over today.
So I think the first question that a lot of people have is DCP able to share these slides with community board members for referral, in the future?
Yeah, we can share that with you, Vicky, and then if you want to disseminate it to people who want it, that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's great. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna stop sharing your screen, and then I'm gonna start bringing folks into panelist mode, so you'll be able to unmute. But I do ask that folks raise their hands as they are promoted to panelists so that we can go in order.
Great.
And then we can have a nice, fun discussion.
And guys, I'm sorry, this is Akyung. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm gonna keep my video off because my bandwidth is like coming in and out, and I think this is best if I just are not showing my face.
Okay, that is totally fine.
And then
Vicky, go ahead.
Sorry, just one other thing I'll say is, in addition to sharing our slides, we'll also share a link to an online version of what's called the zoning handbook. And it's a pretty lengthy document, but it basically makes some of the more complicated elements of zoning really easy to understand. And it's comprehensive. So if, for example, a community board member is looking at a rezoning application, the zoning handbook has a really easy to understand version of what that zoning district essentially entails, right? Which uses it allows, which bulk regulations come with that, and sort of what it actually looks like on the ground with some real world examples.
Great, thank you. So it looks like folks are starting to come over from the other side, as they say. So Dolores, if you want to be the first to ask your question. And actually, before we start, I just want to reiterate, please keep your comments and questions focused to the presentation. We do want to get to everybody, so I just want to ask to be mindful of the time. So thank you. Go ahead, Dolores.
Okay, thanks. So I really have 3 questions. 2 are connected though. So when city planning, when someone has put an application in for an upzoning and city planning, and I'm not going to use your term, so I apologize, when you make the decision to include another parcel in close proximity, I have concern in that the other property owner whose property could be upzoned is not receiving notification. And we've actually had that occur recently twice in Community Board 14. The other property owner had no knowledge that he was being rezoned. And then associated with that, I've seen in Florida, in North Carolina, and in Nassau County, when a property is being rezoned, there is actually a very large public notice. In Nassau County, it's orange, the background, notifying everyone who goes past that property that there will be a public hearing on rezoning. So why doesn't the city do that? And why are adjacent property owners not notified? And then when you answer that, I have one other quick question.
Okay, Dolores, I asked that we can come back to your last question after
Sure.
we've heard a few other
No problem.
questions.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dolores. So your first question was essentially related to when we do an upzoning, why oftentimes neighbors of the lot, or excuse me, when an upzoning comes through our house, why neighbors of the lot are not notified. So essentially, most of the time when these applications come through, they're done by private entities, and so us as city planning, we have a bureaucratic obligation to process those applications. They're required to submit certain components related, depending on sort of the scope of what they're proposing. But there's no mandate as to how they approach outreach. So we at city planning will often encourage them to make sure that people in the neighboring community are aware of what they're doing and are aligned with what they're
Andy,
doing.
I'm sorry, I must not have explained myself correctly. When city planning has made the decision for contextual reasons to upzone another property with someone's application, right? So someone came in, they want to upzone, and you look at the property and say, we want to make this more cohesive. So this adjacent across the street, we're going to upzone that at the same time. That property owner does not receive notification from city planning that their property is being looked at for upzoning. Am I making sense?
Yeah, you're making sense. So, sorry, go ahead.
Hey, hi, this is Kyung from City Planning. I believe that part of the private application that is the project that is in focus, and then the adjacent property that you're talking about, Dolores, they are as part of the ULURP application required to give notice to the property that is being rezoned as well.
So
So it
the
should be-
private applicant must
Mhm.
notify the additional property that city planning has identified for upzoning. The private applicant is, even though they didn't ask for that, they're required to give the notification that city planning is upzoning.
So city planning is not upzoning, they're in that specific application you're talking about, the private application. It is part of their private application. So yes, the applicant is required to notify the adjacent property owners. That is
Okay.
part of their, I think it's like the first 3 application requirements. I'll have to look at the applicant requirements that's found in our website.
Please, because that's not what you're describing, it's not what's happening, so I'm not going to take up any more time, but maybe we can get further clarification at another time. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks, Dolores. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like answered about zoning? All right, Floor, if I'm saying that correctly, go ahead.
Yes, very good. Thank you, Vicky. My question was regarding in Queens, we have a lot of co-ops and condos, and I was wondering if the when you have an area with a lot of buildings on it, like Windsor Park has 20 buildings, I assume that the streets belong to the city and the grounds belong to the co-op, if I'm not mistaken, or I don't know if you know how that works. But I was wondering, they have buildings, sports complex and outdoor swimming pools, and I was wondering, because people are asking, how close to a building, a residential building, can you build up to it? Like there's literally like a sports center built right up to a building. Is there any sort of guideline that they're supposed to follow in terms of, or anything in the zoning rules about something like that?
So I'll do my best to answer the first question, and the answer is it usually depends. So sometimes, when you have like a big building like the one you mentioned, I can think of quite a few throughout the borough that are like that. A lot of times the internal roads are privately operated and owned. Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they are. It really depends. So if you want to even post in the chat, you can post your contact information. We can take a look to see if that one's city operated. And then, hey, Kyung, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in regards to the second question, zoning will sometimes give rules for different adjacencies, but I think in the one that you're citing, typically there won't be that much regulations revolving around that. A lot of times there will be rules regarding spaces between one building and the next, but spaces between building and yards, the zoning doesn't speak to that as well.
Thank you. I also just wanted to ask you if you can share the slides so that we, have that information afterwards, if it's possible to email them.
Definitely. We'll share it through Vicky, if that's okay with you, and then you can probably disseminate it to everyone who attended.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have everyone's contact info and I'll make sure to email it to everyone. So
think-
thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a
Oh.
great idea, Vicky. With Dolores's question about, the previous question, I think Andy and I will regroup and follow up with all the answers as possible and then send it to you. And then you could send as you wish.
Great. Did anyone else have questions? Feel free to just jump in or raise your hand. Thought we'd have more folks with
Hi.
their hands raised with burning questions.
Hi, I just had a quick question. If a community board, or let's say if a community organization wants to start a rezoning application, what are the first steps, or what is the first step?
Sure. So essentially, if you as a private entity, so just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, if you as a private entity want to change the zoning in your lot or in a larger area, what you would do to go about that?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, let's say, it's not a private entity, right? Let's say it's a community organization, for that matter, who wants to do, multiple blocks. Is the process different from a private entity?
No, the process would be essentially the same. I'll try to do my best to give a really brief summary of what happens. So there's kind of two moments in time, right? One is before a project is certified as complete by the City Planning Commission. And then once that happens, there's the entire public review process of that project, which is also known as ULURP, which obviously the community board has a say in that. So in the time that between the inception of a project and when it's certified as complete by the Department of City Planning, typically an applicant, whether that be a developer or a community group or another city agency, they will come to us and they'll say, here's what we're proposing. Here's our scope of actions, right? So we might be zoning this from this to this, or we might be proposing a change in the zoning text, or we might be proposing to map mandatory inclusionary housing on a certain area. So we'll kind of work with them to get a really clear and articulate sense of what exactly they're proposing. Then depending on what they're proposing, there's kind of a semi-parallel environmental review process where we kind of understand if you enacted this change, what is the greatest possible impact that could happen? And that's called the reasonable worst case development scenario. So let's just say your community organization wants to rezone an entire block, right? Based on that, there will be an analysis of if you rezone that entire block, essentially what would be the scope of impacts from a development perspective. So it might be X amount of new units, X amount of new commercial floor space, X amount of new parking spots, so on. Once we have a really clear understanding of what that reasonable worst case development scenario is, the applicant is then obligated to submit a land use application, which is a package of information that shows a description of the proposal. It'll show photographs, it'll have different maps, it might have different drawing packages of what you're proposing. And then there will be a separate environmental assessment statement that really fleshes out from a pretty holistic perspective, what is the broad range of impacts of this development from a land use perspective, from an air quality perspective, from a noise perspective, all those kinds of things. And then it's us at City Planning's responsibility to do a detailed technical review of both the land use application and the environmental assessment statement. Once both of those are complete, and if the environmental assessment statement does not determine that there's going to be significant impacts related to that, there's a whole other extra step if there is determinations to be significant impacts. So once those two applications are complete, the City Planning Commission certifies the application is complete, and then it goes through the public review process, or ULURP, where first the community board takes a look at it and provides their recommendation. Then the borough president takes a look at it and provides his recommendation. And then the City Planning Commission votes on it. And then the city council votes on it and Once all of those things are in, then the change to the zoning map or the zoning text is implemented. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a kind of a long and complicated process, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you, Andy.
I actually had a quick follow-up question to Sam's question.
Sure.
Could you clarify, so a private applicant for a ULURP application is a private applicant essentially means anyone that is a non-city entity? Is that right? Or is there?
Yeah, so anyone can make, I guess maybe a private application is a little bit limiting to what or who can actually make an application. Anyone can make an application for a land use change citywide. So it can be a private developer, it can be a consortium of private developers, it can be a neighborhood organization, it can be another city agency, it can be the Department of City Planning itself. So everyone kind of has to go by the same process, essentially.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we have Alton Smith who has a question. I'm gonna ask him to unmute. Alton, can you hear us? Okay, we'll come back. Does anyone else, I think Dolores, you had a third question. Just want to come back to that.
Yes, thank you. I don't remember which slide it was on, but I just wrote this down and I wanted clarification. It said zoning can encourage or require open public space. So can you give us an example of where city planning would require open space versus encourage open space? Is there, how does that actually work? Is it based on the zoning or a recommendation from city planning?
Sure. So I'll do my best, and Hey Kyung, you can fill me in on anything that I might miss. There's a couple scenarios where open space may be required. One of which is if you're looking to develop on certain but not all waterfront lots. So certain waterfront lots have public access requirements that may require public open space to be included in that. There's also certain special permits. So if a applicant wants to avail of a certain types of special permits that may change the bulk shape on a lot that is typically allowed per the zoning. In those cases, sometimes there are requirements for publicly accessible open space. Otherwise, in a case-by-case basis, depending on the context of the lot and what the state of open space access is in a particular community, we may encourage applicants to provide some amount of open space, but that's on a case-by-case basis.
So in terms of open spaces, do you look at the shadow effect? So if you had two buildings being built close together and one building is going to live in shadow, would you require additional open space so that doesn't happen and they get to have sunlight in their apartments?
It depends on the extent of the shadow impact. So most developments seeking a change in the zoning map will have a section of their environmental assessment statement that goes over the potential shadow impacts of a development. So in the city's environmental quality review laws, or SEQR, there's a certain procedure for determining the extent of shadow impacts. So essentially what will happen is an applicant will analyze the shadow impacts of a development proposal. Depending on how that looks, there may be one or two extra rounds of more detailed analysis. And then depending on the scale of impacts, then if it's determined to be a significant impact, then there may be some kind of required change to mitigate that. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, almost. So this this, what I'm going to ask you could be a tough question. You may not be able to answer it, and I certainly understand that. So what does city planning consider to be an acceptable level of shadow?
That's a little bit
Like what
outside of
makes
my-
it significant? What makes it significant? That they get no sunlight, they only get 10% sunlight, they get.
Hey, Kim, you can fill in if you've got a little bit more details. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. I could
Yeah, no,
probably
I
best
appreciate
to
that.
follow
I
up with,
appreciate
if you could, or I'll get your contact from Vicky and I can hopefully follow up with some specific guidance. It's typically included in the city's seeker regulations.
Okay.
So I'll provide sources to that.
I mean, I have nothing else to add because Annie's covered it, but Annie's correct. It's a trigger point or a number or a mark within the seeker manual that that is analyzed. So it would have to be very specific to the project. But Dolores, you're correct. It is it's a very specific question related to that specific site.
But would city planning ever approve a development where there's 100% shadow?
So it's a little bit, I think, and again, I don't want to mess this up too much, but so the way that shadows are analyzed is they look at the impact of the shadows on a couple different days of the year when the extent of the impact is most significant at a couple different times of the day. And
Mhm.
Yeah,
depending
it's
on how
usually
much
winter
shadow
and
coverage-
summer.
Yeah. And depending on how much shadow coverage there is on those days, yeah. So I think, as Vicky said, there's I think a day in June and a day in December, and depending on the extent of the shadow impacts, then there's a specific determination. But whether it's total or how much of it is partial and when mitigations are required, I'll have to check up on that.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'll just say too, Dolores, one of the things that a part of this webinar series is to hopefully do a webinar totally devoted to seeker and talking about all the different mitigations that come with a possible development, because I know there are always a lot of questions about that as well. So I just wanted to say that. And then Alton, if we have you, hopefully you can unmute and ask your question. Okay, so we'll come back to you if and when you are able to unmute. I actually had a quick question. So in terms of, I hesitate to bring this up because I know it's actually outside the scope of the presentation, but I do want to ask about 197A plans and how you may or may not work with different groups when folks suggest them. Or file them, I should say.
That's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. Hey, Kyung, do you have experience with those in your time as city planning? Let me follow up with you about that, Vicky. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I just was curious. But yeah, anyone else, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss? Okay, Phil, go ahead.
I was holding back, hoping other questions would come, but I'm gonna bring this one up and see if but you have any information on this. The proposal by the governor for our housing compact. Basically, the way I understand it, it's gonna, if that goes through, it's going to allow severe significant high density in areas, especially around transit areas. What is city planning, or what impact, or how are you guys going to interact with that if or can you, if that does become a law?
So your guess would be about as good as mine at this point. They haven't made any determination internally on that yet. we'll probably have a better idea if it's enacted into law. But we haven't received any sort of guidance or additional information on how that would be employed at a local level.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay, anyone else?
Could I just suggest, for, I don't know how many people are very new to zoning, if we went back to one of the screens and just talk briefly about each of the residential zoning and what that encompasses, how large the buildings are, like a general overview? Would that be possible for new folks to know what's the difference between an R1 and an R6?
I think that would be fine. Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
We'll just go ahead and pull that up.
I'm gonna do my best. I don't have the detailed handbook on me right now. And this slideshow
No,
is
yeah,
very,
I think
very-
just a general, I think general for people that are new to it, a general will be a good start for them.
sure.
It's a long time to learn zoning.
So the most sort of analogous slide I have is this one right here. Can you see it, by the way? It's not letting me do full screen at the moment.
If you go to slideshow at the top, I think you should be able to
Oh yeah, there it is.
put it to full screen.
So unfortunately, oh, there it goes. Oh, there it is. Because for some reason, there it goes. Okay. So Dolores, I'm going to do my best because I don't have sort of the detailed slides on this available right now. But I will send to Vicky a link to the zoning handbook, which has some really great resources on sort of a really simple crash course to each one of these districts in more detail. So what you'll see on the left-hand side here is a list of residential, commercial, and manufacturing districts. And they're kind of categorized based on thematically speaking, what general types of development they encompass or facilitate. So R1 and R2 are the lowest density districts in the city. You see these in much more suburbanized parts of Queens. These usually only facilitate single family detached houses. And then you kind of bump up to the R3 and R4 families, and even to something like R5A. And these allow both single and two family detached, but it wouldn't allow attached houses. So you'd have to have some space between you and your neighbor. And then when you get to R31 and R41, those are single and two family detached and semi-detached. So when we say semi-detached, it basically means like if you have a house, maybe the lot to the right of you, you'll have another house attached to it, but you'll have open space to the left of you. So you'll have half of your house will be directly adjacent to another house, but the other half will have open space. And then when you get to like R4B, for example, those are allowing one and two family detached, semi-detached, and attached. And then there's like a really broad range of zoning districts that allow all kinds of housing. So this can be detached, this can be semi-attached, it can be fully attached, and it can be multifamily, right? And you see those in really low density districts like R32, and then all the way up to R10 or equivalent, which is like what we see in downtown Jamaica. I think parts of Long Island City have either R10 equivalents or something similar. You'll see this in Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, things like that. And then kind of like everything in between, right? So the most simple way to describe sort of the difference as you go from a lower density district like R32 to a really high density district like R10 is the amount of floor area ratio that's permitted. There are a lot of other regulations that differentiate these, but the most simple one to understand how they're differentiated is through the floor area ratio. So something like an 5 might have a floor area ratio of 1.25, meaning the total amount of floor space can only be 1.25 times larger than the amount of lot area that it has. So if it's a 10,000 square foot lot, you would only be able to get 12,500 square feet of lot or floor space, all the way to like an R10, which would have 12 FAR, right? So if it's a 1,000 square foot lot and it's on an R10, you could go to 12,000 square feet. And like I said, it's everything in between. And some of these are mapped in the context of a neighborhood specifically. Some of these allow for a little bit more flexibility as to what the shape of the building could be. That's kind of a 120-second crash course to zoning or the different residential districts. But I'll provide a resource that has a lot more information.
So Andy, I placed on the chat the PDF that's on our website. It's been a while since I took a look at it, and it's very comprehensive. So if folks want to just kind of scroll and see if you have questions, further questions on the R districts, let us know.
I'll make sure that this link is shared with the slide deck as well to everybody who attended
Perfect.
tonight. So Richard, do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. Thank you. I was just a follow-up to what you just shared. Is there an app that you can use that can help you understand what you just explained?
So we don't have an app, but we have a couple resources that we can share. I think Hey Kyung shared one in the chat, but I'll share a couple more through Vicky, and she can disseminate to that both to you and everyone else on the call. Our website has really easy to understand profiles for each one of these zoning districts. So that's one. The second is our zoning handbook, which provides, I think, a really great crash course to zoning, and it breaks it down by like, in resident districts, like here's the key differences. And if you want to know a little bit more about one specific district, here's like a really, really concise fact sheet with all the key info for that specific zoning district. And then the third thing that we have that I use like almost every day in my job is a website called Zola, and that stands for Zoning and Land Use. And that allows you to type in a specific address and you can see what the zoning is for that address. And then usually there's like a hyperlink. So if, for example, you type in your address and it says R6B, it'll have a link where you can click on R6B and see exactly what that means from a zoning related perspective.
Got it. Thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem.
Richard, if you want to create that app, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll drop our email.
Definitely. Definitely. Thanks.
I will say the Zola website is probably the closest thing to an app experience, like to get
Right.
all that information in one spot. So I'll make sure to share all of those links in an email for everybody with like a little blurb about each one, because it really is an invaluable resource to be able to look up an address and kind of get all, zoning and building information. You can find property records. There's a lot of different resources that are attached to the Zola, the zoning and land use portal. That's very, very helpful. So does anyone else have any questions or comments? I think if they're trickling in, we could probably end a little early today, just so everyone can have a nice evening. But I just want to give folks another couple minutes if there's anything else they want to discuss or ask. Well, all right. Thanks, everyone. So like I said, this is recorded, so we're going to hopefully post this on our website soon on the queensbp.org land use page. We're hoping to redesign that page a little bit so that we can have these videos front and center. And like we said, feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat for folks. And you also probably have my email since I sent a confirmation email before this webinar started, but any follow-up questions, feel free to let me know. I'll make sure to disseminate all the information we talked about tonight too. And otherwise, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.